Welcome to the Wade Center Podcast,
a podcast of Wheaton College.
And I think that's what Lewis does so well. He's able to take these really complicated ideas, put them in ordinary language, but then because he tells us, well, I'm really an amateur, we kind of believe him.
Welcome to the Wade Center Podcast. I'm Jim Beitler, the director of the Wade Center. I'm here once again with my colleague and co-director of this podcast.
Co-director of the podcast?
Yeah, why not?
Did I get a promotion?
Maybe.
Okay.
Well, we'll see.
All right.
We'll see how you do this time.
I'll add it to my list of titles.
Aaron Hill.
Yes.
Thanks for being here, Aaron. And we are joined today by Jeffrey Barbeau, professor of theology at Wheaton College, editor of the Coleridge Bulletin, and a writer on British Romanticism, religion and literature, and the history of Christian thought. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm really glad to be here.
He's got a lot of books, some of which include The Cambridge Companion to British Romanticism and Religion, The Spirit of Methodism, Religion in Romantic England, and more. But the one we really want to talk about today is The Last Romantic, C.S. Lewis, English Literature and Modern Theology, which is coming out. It's out now, isn't it?
I believe IVP already has copies.
This book came out of the Ken and Jean Hansen Lectureship, which is an annual faculty lecture series named in honor of former Wheaton College trustee Ken Hansen and his wife Jean, and endowed in their memory by Walter and Darlene Hansen. Before we begin, I'd just say we have another Hansen lecture coming up with Aubrey Buster in the spring, so look out for that.
Yeah.
So welcome again to the podcast, Jeff.
Thanks so much. I'm looking forward to Dr. Buster's lectures too. Actually, they're going to be fantastic.
So this book, The Last Romantic, I'd love to dive into this book, but before we do that, could you tell our listeners a little bit about Romanticism? Could you explain it so we can kind of get into the book that way?
Well, if it'll help sales, I'd love to say that it's exactly what you need for your love life, but that would be a mistake. And a lot of times people do think of Romanticism as something about one's love life. In fact, it is typically associated with a movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And in particular, I'm focused on British Romanticism, which we often identify with either or both a chronology or a mood. And so just briefly, let me say, chronologically, we think of Romanticism as from around the time of the 1780s, early 1790s, until about the early 1830s. And so it covers about a 40, 50-year period there. As a mood, it often is associated with different poets and writers who emphasize things like the imagination, the intuition, a sort of new spirit of poetry and thinking, and about the world and about God and about the human person. So Romanticism covers quite a lot of different things, and it's in different fields as well. Poetry, I've already mentioned, but also it has elements in the visual arts. It has scientific aspects, philosophical, theological. There's a lot happening in the church and in politics. And all of these things get caught up in the big bundle of what we call Romanticism.
And Lewis was, you're arguing in this book that Lewis was influenced by that tradition profoundly.
Absolutely.
Could you maybe just say a little bit about that?
Well, I think it's often the case that people recognize that Lewis, as someone who was not only a writer of literature, but a student of literature, was influenced by different periods. And we often think of the medieval and Renaissance thought that is certainly prominent in his work. But many people are uncomfortable, actually, with thinking about the writers that immediately preceded him. And I'm not really thinking of the Victorians so much as the Romantics, because Romantics have that kind of different mood, and they're seen as somewhat edgy sometimes. As a result, I think people are a little bit uncomfortable wanting to say, well, Lewis is really quite reliant on the Romantics. I'm happy to explain why if it would help. But
yeah, that would help.
Well, I think it's in part because Romanticism is sometimes seen as too personal, too subjective, and too much dependent on intuition, feeling, emotion, things like that. I mean, our great poets in the British tradition, think of people like William Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats. That's just the big six that we typically associate with Romanticism, but there are many, many others as well. They're emphasizing this sort of new mood of imagination and feeling in different ways, of course. If then we say that someone like Lewis is also dependent not just on imagination, but this sort of interior life, it can feel very slippery. And in the 20th century, there was a bit of a reaction against that kind of thing because of maybe some of the after effects of the movement. So there has been a tendency to say, maybe that's not really what he's doing.
Yeah.
And this applies in a lot of ways to how people are thinking about Lewis and faith in particular. So Lewis, the kind of emphasis on the personal as a way to reach God, the emphasis on feelings and subjectivity, that's where there are some problems.
Well, that's right, because if Lewis is one of our greatest 20th century Christian apologists, and that's a time when Christians are really trying to speak about the kind of objective truth about who God is, then if you allow that language of the personal to come in, the role of the emotions and of feeling, it can become uncomfortable, and it might, cast some doubt even on his apologetic approach. Now, let me just tell you a personal story here. I remember for many years, I thought of Lewis as perhaps this almost too rational kind of Christian. So that while I was very interested in Lewis as an undergraduate, he really helped me to think about faith, about theology and the arts in so many ways. But the more I studied theology, the more I sort of distanced myself from him, almost unintentionally, really, because he seemed to give too many easy responses. And I think I began to think of Lewis as something of a kind of rationalist.
Yeah.
But when I came back to his work after many years, and I'm so grateful for the Hansen lecture series and the sponsorship and the Wade Center and all the resources there, when I came back to Lewis, I started to see these resonances with Romanticism. And actually, what appeared to me as very simple answers were actually really thoughtful, culturally alert, attuned to theology and philosophy in ways I had not even expected. And that's the part of Lewis I want to bring out. And I think that might actually not only help those who already love Lewis, but people who might become interested in Lewis when they see he's doing something a bit more sophisticated than we think.
In the book, you talk about how Lewis is asking questions through the lens of individual experience, and you've talked about that sort of subjectivity and individual experience versus objectivity. He talks about the Tao. In Abolition of Man. Growing up, a lot of the Christian apologetic stuff that I was exposed to placed a lot of focus on the sort of objective truth. Like that was, Christianity was almost synonymous with this idea of like, there is an objective truth, everyone has access to it, we all agree on what it should be, people who disagree are just rebelling from God kind of a thing. And so you use that to all these proofs for God's existence and, a lot of rationalism, sort of structuralist, positive framework of things. I feel like in the book you do a really good job of framing why that was controversial for Lewis to be associated with Romanticism, and how Lewis was trying to kind of synthesize the two things. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So one of the after effects of Romanticism in theology was a push in that subjective interior realm too hard meant that people started to think God was just a figment of the imagination. Maybe if it's really about our interior life and our inward self, our inward feelings, then maybe God is nothing more than something we've dreamed up. And so if we take that kind of romantic aftermath as being the sum total of what's happening in the movement, and especially people like Wordsworth and Coleridge, that I think Lewis, we can clearly say, was reading very closely, and that's part of the archival story of this book as well. If we see that after effect as the main thing, then maybe if we really give ground that Lewis is turning to that emotional or that inward self in any way, however you want to cast that, then perhaps his apologetics aren't so firm. I actually think it's otherwise. I think that when you start to read Lewis through this lens and you start to kind of pay attention to it, you suddenly find that he often begins by saying to his reader, his audience, there's a personal experience I want to kind of start with. And it catches us off guard, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so one of my favorite spots in Mere Christianity is that wonderful passage when he talks about having given a lecture and it's about theology and that member of the Royal Air Force. I always have this kind of vision of this kind of grizzled guy. And he's like, oh, I've known God. I've experienced him out there. And Lewis doesn't deny it. He says, I think that experience probably was true, but it's not the whole thing. It's not the whole story. And so we don't actually, with Lewis, have to go totally down the road and ignore the truth of things beyond the self. But we don't want to ignore it either.
Yeah, so he gives, I was going to actually ask you about that in the book, because I was glad you brought that up. The Royal Air Force officer, and so he's giving this example of sort of being in a foxhole and having this religious experience. And Lewis uses this metaphor of being like on the ocean versus having a map of the ocean. Can you talk about that a little bit? I feel like that's the kind of thing that Lewis introduces and you go, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's how you bring the two together and they can both be true at the same time.
Those metaphors.
Well, I think this is one of the reasons that so many people are attracted to Lewis, actually, is his ability to speak about really important things in ways that we get. So he can speak about that experience of being on the beach. Anyone who's been at the edge of the ocean has probably had that experience of looking out at the vastness of it all. Mm-hmm. And in that moment, in that one place, there's something that's happening there that's rather profound within us. Maybe it's an encounter of beauty, or it's a sort of crisis of the self being so small. I don't know. But we each have something, I think, when we get to that place. And Lewis seems to suggest, like, okay, that's real. That's important. There's something happening within you. It's probably a kind of longing for something more. But if you stop there, and if that's all you have, that actually can become problematic. He doesn't want to deny that experience, but he wants to see it set in a much broader context. And in many ways, this is really theologically quite rich and profound. He says, you have an experience perhaps of God, but if you think that is the sum total of it all, then maybe you need to see that you belong to a much larger picture. There have been many others who have had experiences before you, kind of like going to the beach. If you want to stay on the beach and look out at the ocean, that's great, but it won't take you anywhere. If you want to travel somewhere, if you want to sort of see what that looks like in the context of many other experiences, you need the map.
Yeah.
You know, you talk about Lewis as drawing on personal experience as a way in, and that being connected to romanticism. But then he's also got his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, which is doing something even more in relation to romanticism. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? I really enjoyed this second chapter of the book.
Well, I really enjoyed writing it. I'm someone who's very much a student of memoir, autobiography. I think about journaling, and what I didn't know was that it was actually during the Romantic period and during the 18th century, kind of leading up into that period, that sort of journaling and memoir conversion narratives really takes off, not just among a few people, but among many. And so I think we have to actually, in some ways, see what Lewis is doing and telling his own story in light of that history in particular.
And yet he says it's, what's the word? Suffocatingly subjective.
That's right.
Could you unpack that for us? Why is that important?
Well, first of all, I always tell my students to read the preface to any book, and especially with a Lewis book. You know, a lot of readers, we get to a book and we want to skip over that front matter, not worry about it too much. And we might do the same with Lewis, like it's sort of the unnecessary nonfiction bit before the really good fantasy starts on any number of stories. And in his autobiography, his conversion narrative in many ways, he has this initial set of comments, including this line saying, I fear it's suffocatingly subjective. And what an odd thing to say about as your
spiritual autobiography.
That's right. Like, what else would it be? Although maybe that's sometimes what we want Lewis to do, to tell a story that's not really about him, but about everyone. But he has to start with what happened to him. So I think one aspect of it is that sense of the interior that even he kind of recognizes in the 20th century. There's something of a friction there that he's worried about. And then I think it is worth noting that, of course, the title itself, Surprised by Joy, is drawn from a William Wordsworth poem. Now, he sort of says, well, it's not really the main thing. But I think we find Lewis saying that about a lot of things.
Yeah. I was going to say, Pilgrim's Regress feels like his first attempt at a sort of spiritual autobiography, and he literally like calls out Romanticism in the long form version of that title there. But it's the narrative structure of it, I think personally, is not as conducive to reading and to applying to your own life as Surprised by Joy is. That attempt at sort of stepping back and being objective and talking about all these theological concepts, even in Pilgrim's Regress, I just don't think it's as powerful of a book as Surprised by Joy is. Can you talk a little bit about the way that Lewis uses subjectivity and romanticism to make him a more effective communicator? You talk about in the book how he keeps deprecating himself, saying, like, I'm not a theologian.
That's right.
And we're kind of like, maybe we shouldn't take him at face value when he says, believe what he does, not what he says, right?
That's
you talk about that in the book. Can you talk about that a little bit about how Lewis, as a romantic, makes him a better communicator and sort of theologian?
Well, I think he recognizes the power of language in the common sense. Now, remember, Romanticism does quite a lot to help people become students of poetry, of literature. And one of the ways it does it is through kind of language that is ordinary or takes up themes that you might not think are appropriate for something as important and high as literature. It had this very kind of elevated sense at times and in some places. Lewis seems to be picking up on that kind of common language in some ways. He's able to talk about theology, philosophy, without sounding like a theologian or a philosopher often does. So when he starts to tell his story, we seem to realize or intuit that there's like a larger story behind this, but he can just tell us the kind of ordinary experiences and having kind of schoolboy experiences and kind of growing up, and we're just sort of going along with the story, and it seems just so common and ordinary, and yet there's a way in which this is actually about something that's very extraordinary, that's about something quite beyond his own experience. And I think that's what Lewis does so well. He's able to take these really complicated ideas, put them in ordinary language, but then because he tells us, well, I'm really an amateur, we kind of believe him. But the truth is, he actually knows what he's talking about. He is very alert, and that's what the archival experience did for me.
Yeah, do you want to say a little bit more about that? Because you talk about that in the book, the fact that
you mentioned a number of the discoveries that you made, and I thought that was a good element of the book there.
Well, this is a amazing part of what the Hansen lectures allow faculty to do. It provides a purpose, a space. Honestly, it provides funding that it allows us to do that sort of focused work on the Wade authors. So when I was asked to approach this in terms of Romanticism and Lewis, I thought, well, I need to spend some time in the archives. I want to see what he was reading. I want to see if he wrote anything in the margins. I want to see what's there in his own personal library. And as I did that, it was really a remarkable experience because you have to get used to any author you're reading. Now, I've worked with other authors and their marginalia before, and some are really expansive. Coleridge is a wonderful example of this because Coleridge loved to borrow people's books, and they would sort of say, give it to me in a couple months, and he would go through and he would write paragraph-length marginalia. Now, when I got to Lewis, I was kind of working as a Coleridgean, expecting paragraphs in these books, but he doesn't do it. Lewis is much more sparing, and so you have to spend a lot of time working through, seeing how he's making his marginalia, and where they really start to pop is when he does say something that's unusual or unexpected. So that was a really wonderful experience of just sort of reading with Lewis, seeing the books he's reading, seeing how he marks them up.
And in fact, if you buy a copy of this book, one of the things you'll see, which is a real treasure, is some of these annotations in Lewis's books are reproduced in The Last Romantic. So readers are going to be able to see that for themselves.
I am so grateful for those who made that possible. It is a special part of the book because I think when someone sees the actual script, the handwriting of an author that they admire, it brings a whole new dimension to their life. You start to see the way he forms the words even.
Yeah, and you have that unpublished, at least until now, poem that Lewis writes where he's kind of inspired by riffing on Wordsworth. I thought that was a really neat inclusion.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. There, of course, Lewis himself wanted to be a poet. He wasn't a great poet, but in his early career, that was an especially important thing to him. And so every once in a while, in the back of the books that he owned, you'll see ways that he indexes a book or highlights an interesting passage. And in the back of one of his collections of Wordsworth's poetry, we find him trying his hand out on some lines. And those lines are somewhat fragmentary in the sense that we don't know kind of exactly where they belong. It's likely because we have dated them into the 1920s. We can see he's working towards Dimer. But there's sort of four fragments there, and they aren't necessarily duplicating Romanticism or Wordsworth specifically. But I can't help but imagine that he's sitting there reading Wordsworth and inspired by this figure that he comes to really value very highly. He tries his own hand. And he imagines in the 1920s, he kind of imagines that one day he'll be greater than Wordsworth. Now, that's no small claim. Wordsworth is truly one of the greatest poets in the English language. But he esteemed to such. He wanted that. And so you can imagine him just sitting there as a young person in his 20s and just sort of striking out some lines, writing and kind of working on it. And so we have those at the back of this book, and I'm interested to see what people think.
Can you talk a little bit about the abolition of man?
Oh, you stole my next question.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's what I was thinking. Listeners are going to say, well, what about abolition of man?
Yeah.
Because it's all about objectivity, isn't it? I mean, the subjective is the...
Well, and he starts out with the example of the waterfall in Coleridge. And
so what do you do with that?
That's right. Well, I think first of all, I'm glad you're noting this, and you've noted the waterfall. The Abolition of Man is a strange book in some ways, and I hate to say that if everyone loves it as their favorite or something, but it is a strange book, and there's a couple things I'll note. Number one, right away in that first section there, you start to notice how many times in the first couple of chapters, actually, romantic authors are mentioned. So just right off the bat, I just want to say it's very clear that his dialogue partners are romantic poets. Mm-hmm. Number two, you mentioned Coleridge and the Waterfall. It is striking that he begins a book about the defense of faith and about the defense of education and how we ought to train people with this kind of obscure reference to a story about Coleridge of the Waterfall and a discussion of the sublime. Now, I don't think the sublime is a topic that most people walk around talking about in their ordinary lives. But the sublime was a topic of deep interest to the Romantics, this idea of the sort of waterfall having a kind of grandeur or a power. There's lots of theories about kind of what the sublime is. So right off the bat, I would say Lewis is drawing on not only romantic authors, but romantic topics to address how we think about language and about education, and I think actually ultimately about faith. So that is a profound book, and it's not that he's denying the objective or only relying on the subjective. And I think the example really shows, you'll have to see the fuller discussion I have in the book, it shows that for Lewis, our interior selves matter, but that we often need to be trained, and that's where the education element comes in. We must be trained to think rightly about some of our feelings and experiences. So it's not just the unfettered experience or the unfettered imagination. It is also very much the training and formation. And I think that's an important part.
There's still an objective reality out there. It's just a matter of kind of creating a fit between our interior lives and the world out there.
That's right. And I think for Coleridge and for Lewis, the sense of a need to be formed to recognize how to understand our own feelings rightly is important.
Yeah, as I was reading that section, and there's a one paragraph in particular, I actually wrote praise for this paragraph. I feel like you've managed to distill the essence of what Lewis is trying to accomplish in the Abolition of Man.
Thank you.
In a way that I have not seen, honestly, anybody else do. And I've read books on people's interpretation of the abolition of man, heard a lot of different takes. So I thought it was a really good way into it, good analysis. I think it was really insightful. And hopefully, if people get a copy of the book, it'll help them gain a better sense and then maybe go back and reread Abolition of Man. And because it is one of those books where you read it the first, I don't know, like 3 or 4 times, you're kind of like, what is he talking about? And it kind of functions almost like a Rorschach test for what you think Lewis is about, because there are a lot of people that come away from it and they go, oh, he's all about the Tao and the objective, and they almost feel as if he's rejecting Coleridge and emotions and stuff, and they kind of come away with, I think, the wrong conclusion there. So I really appreciated your analysis of that.
Well, that's really kind to say. I think for me, it is a great example of how if you understand what's happening in Romanticism, it opens up the text in fresh ways. And in many ways, that's the goal of the book, is that when we start looking at the Romantics with Lewis and Lewis with the Romantics, things appear that we may not have seen before.
So why is Lewis the last Romantic?
Well, I have to admit there's probably others who might want to get that designation. But in some ways, I think he is the last Romantic because at some point you have to sort of call it. And I think in some ways you might say he is a kind of fulfillment of many of those goals. And so he is an individual who is like many of the Romantics in that capacious, that kind of wide understanding he has of many different fields. He's drawing on the imagination. He is thinking about faith, about Christianity, about the religions. And in some sense, you might say he is the kind of culmination of many of their goals. It's not to say chronologically there might not be others. I mean, certainly someone like a Barfield has a claim to this sort of same concern. But I think in Lewis, you actually find a kind of culmination of many of those aspirations of what we would call the Romantic mood.
Are there ways that he pushes against Romanticism that are important?
Yes, I think so. He benefits from time and the passage of reactions to the Romantic movement. So I think we find in ways that won't appear to us as obvious immediately, but we find him offering subtle critiques along the way. I was thinking earlier of one of the questions about how nature itself, the experience maybe at the beach, is instructive. Lewis is very careful to say, it's fine to say your prayers outside, and it might be that they even enhance your prayer life. But if you go outside into nature, into your garden on a long walk, and your goal is to sort of feel something, like Wordsworth traipsing the mountains, or like Coleridge kind of imagining these scenes from childhood that he wishes he had, right? If you take that kind of romantic vision of nature, and that's your goal, that you'll have a spiritual experience in it like they did, you'll miss it. And I think Lewis benefits from the ability to look back and say, like, okay, the Romantics have been received as sort of returning us to nature. This is a time, of course, it's the Romantics who gave us things like walking as leisure, right?
Yeah.
If you were sort of walking around before the Romantic period, you were kind of lost. You were kind of struggling. You might have been without an occupation.
Yeah.
And they give us that sense of the leisure, the pleasures, the kind of spiritual power of the encounter with nature. So Lewis is able to say, yes, it could give you that. But if that's what you're seeking, you're missing something. Instead, those are signposts, and they point us towards the one who is the true and the living God.
Yeah. We don't need to get in too deep into the weeds here, but that your comment about the natural world made me think of something you talk about in the book, which is left-wing Hegelianism, and how that leads into kind of a pantheism that Lewis critiques in a number of different books that he writes. Could you talk about that a little bit, about that sort of critique of, because that appreciation for nature can go wrong in a direction where it's not just that, in a sort of, to use a theologian, Feuerbach, you didn't mention him earlier, but that's who you're talking about, of our view of God as sort of a self-projection. You can also take a step and say, well, everything is God, and the way we experience God is by going out into creation because everything is God. He sort of leads to a kind of a pantheism. Lewis critiques that in a number of different ways. Could you talk a little bit about that? It's sort of finding a way to have a positive relationship with the natural world without letting it sort of overwrite or erase theology proper.
Well, I should say, I think you've already gotten us into the weeds as soon as you said left-wing Hegelianism.
I was trying to give us some design points there, but...
Well, let me say this. One of the things that is striking to me when I returned to Lewis, again, after many years of study, both in Romanticism and in academic theology, was how important the Trinity is to him. I didn't expect it, to be honest with you. I expected him to be giving especially arguments about sort of God in the abstract and the world, or maybe about Jesus Christ in particular kinds of ways. But when I did a kind of complete reread of the major works, especially, what appeared to me over and over again was the God who is personal, and the triune God in particular. And that, I think, is in some ways a really interesting connection with this Hegelianism you're describing here, because far from being strictly a subjective in which everything else objective kind of disappears, or some sort of pantheistic vision in which, because everything is God, then perhaps nothing in a sense is God, we find Lewis over and over again saying, join in the dance of the triune God. And that is the God who is personal, who wants a connection with us, and in many ways has invited us into a relationship with him. So far from God being either impersonal or very, very distant, you actually find a God who is close and connected and inviting us into something far greater than ourselves. And so it's that Trinitarian dance that I found myself over and over again coming back to.
That restores the place of the Holy Spirit in what Lewis is talking about too.
Absolutely. And then late in the book, and readers will have to sort of discover this on their own, there was a discussion of Christology, or of Jesus, that I entered into as a result of one of the responses to the third chapter in particular. And I was thinking about Jesus, but then it occurred to me that there's really a story throughout this entire book about the Holy Spirit. And I think it may be the case that we have underappreciated Lewis's pneumatology, or his doctrine of the Holy Spirit. That's probably something we should be focusing on a lot more. I think we've been very attracted to discussion of Jesus, and rightly so. But there's a lot of work to be done on who God the Spirit is.
Yeah, I would argue that the Spirit is present, though not always in name, in a lot of his fiction work, in the Space Trilogy and in Chronicles of Narnia. And just because it's not called out, or they're not praying to the Holy Spirit, but the moments, the experiences that they have, oftentimes of revelation or experiences of God, are, I think that Spirit at work. But Lewis just he's not laying out a systematic theology, so you're not going to find the word Holy Spirit in the Chronicles of Narnia, but that doesn't mean that it's not present throughout the pages.
That's right. And in many ways, we have to have eyes to see it. And I think if we don't really pay attention, we can pass over things in Lewis's work. That's the layers, right? Some aspects of his works are more obvious to us than others. Aslan and the association with Jesus, pretty apparent. But if you say, well, I think in his fiction the Spirit is there, readers might be scratching their heads and going to the shelf saying, where might this be? So you may have just sent readers on a really nice chase.
Oh, yeah, go look for it, yeah.
Good job, Aaron.
Thanks. I wanted to ask you, after everything, the book, you've got a copy of the book sitting in front of you right now. How is this going to change your view, not just of Lewis, but of the work that you do on a regular basis here at Wheaton College and as you teach, maybe in your regular life? Is there anything that you took away from this project that you think other people might take away from that's impacted you outside of it?
Well, the number one thing it did is it forced me to go back to Lewis's works in light of theology. We typically leave Lewis to the English department as the writer of fiction and so forth. But in theology, we tend to be very serious about our dialogue partners, and someone who's out there writing fairy tales or fantasy works doesn't usually end up at the top of the syllabus required readings. But when I received the invitation to do the lectures, the first thing I did is I changed my schedule for the next semester, and I threw in a course, C.S. Lewis and Theology. And actually, I think the original title was Theology Through C.S. Lewis, which was intentional. That is to say, if we're reading C.S. Lewis, what theological understanding do we have? How do we understand theology if we start by looking at Lewis, right? So there's lots of ways you can say that. And it was wonderful because my students were ready. I started class the first day and I said, well, who's read Lewis before? And almost every hand around the room went up. Mm-hmm. And I realized that I had a really tall order in front of me because some of them knew Lewis in some ways better than I did. They had, read and reread many of the works. But it helped me to jump into him now with fresh eyes. And I am so grateful for those students. I learned so much from them. They really helped in the dialogue over that whole semester for me to think about, number one, Lewis's work and the theological ideas. Number two, some of the dialogue partners that he had as an author. Like, who was he reading? Who was he reacting to? And also, maybe people after him who may have been relying on Lewis's work in ways that we don't necessarily notice. And there are some examples, I think, of that as well. And I think, three, really considering what's happening in 20th century Christianity. And Lewis belongs in that story. He is a major figure at mid-century, and his writing about Christian faith, his writing about apologetics, about ways to think about the imagination that are deeply religious, these belong in the story that theology is telling of the 20th century as well. So it really shifted the way I thought about how to teach my students and how to connect with things that they love as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeffrey Barbeau, author of the new book, The Last Romantic, C.S. Lewis, English Literature and Modern Theology. Thanks for being with us.
It's been my pleasure.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.